Long story short, Gintama's plot is mostly distinct from historical events. Now, that's not to say that it doesn't take any inspiration from it, but it's more fitting to say that Gintama contains a lot of historical Easter eggs rather than being a retelling of history. Or to put it simply, Gintama is still a work of fiction. Now, I realize that the only definitive way to properly substantiate this is to use a proof that's kind of like mathematical induction, in that you'd first have to examine the base case, say when n equals 1, and proceed to verify whether the statement remains true for all consecutive values of n. Within this context, I would have to go by each individual story arc and prove how they are each their own distinct entity separate from historical events, where n refers to the number of arcs Gintama has. This would frankly be extremely cumbersome, not to mention inelegant. For the sake of brevity, I'll cherry-pick story arcs that sound definitely inspired by history, cover the actual historical influence, and highlight the key differences between the two. As you know, most of the names for Gintama's story arcs are quite self-explanatory. The Benizakura arc is a story arc that covers the Benizakura sword. The Yagyu arc is a story arc that covers the future heir to the Yagyu dojo, Yagyu Kyubei. The Okitamitsuba arc is a story arc that covers Sogo's sister, Okitamitsuba. But what does the title Yoshiwara in Flames mean? In a vacuum, Yoshiwara in Flames tells a story about Gentoki and Ko's attempt to liberate Yoshiwara, a place that has been literally kept underground by Hosen, the former 7th Division captain of the Harusame. The Yoshiwara part of the name is quite self-evident. But what about the in flames? In real life, Yoshiwara was an actual red light district where commoners and samurais masquerading as commoners indulged themselves in their manly desires. Back in the days, the district was located close to the Edo castle, where the shogunate resided. Considering its close proximity, the Bakufu eventually deemed the place to be problematic, because just by virtue of the place existing, it indeliberately seduced any government officials going in and out of the castle.
Oh yeah!
With this in mind, in 1656, there were talks of relocating Yoshiwara closer to the outskirts of Edo. This was initially brought up under the pretext of needing the space for the city to grow. Coincidentally, in 1657, the Great Fire of Meireki destroyed over half of the city of Edo, which includes the pleasure district of Yoshiwara. It was thus consequently rebuilt at the desired new location. How convenient. This chain of events was probably what inspired Sorachi to name the arc as such, but I'm hard-pressed to find any further connections between the two. There was no underground evil ruler named Hosen, and from what I can tell, there weren't any space pirates that tried to take control of the city either. Nevertheless, this is only one arc from across the entirety of the series. Surely there's other better examples. Next, let's take a look at the Shinsengumi Crisis arc. The main antagonist here is Ito Kamotaro, a member of the Shinsengumi who attempted to assassinate his own commander, Kondo Isao. In real life, the Shinsengumi was an actual special police force comprised of ronins, which were samurais who were not subjugated to any lords. And as some of you may have already known, the personnels of the real-life Shinsengumi closely resemble the ones in Gintama. The 1st Division captain, Okita Soji, was the main inspiration for Okita Sogo. The vice commander, Hijikata Toshizo, was the main inspiration for Hijikata Toshiro, and the commander himself, Kondo Isami, was the main inspiration for Kondo Isao. Likewise, Ito Kamotaro was also based on the real-life Shinsengumi staff officer, Ito Kashitaro. From these examples, there's a striking parallel between history and Gintama. Furthermore, the fact that Kondo was a big admirer of Ito, and that Ito had drawn Hijikata's suspicion, is something that is consistent with historical records. But while it's easy to point out striking similarities between the two, it's even easier to point out the differences. Although it's true that Ito had conspired to assassinate Kondo, there were no records specifically pointing that Ito had close ties with the Kiheitai, for example. Nor did he partake in a duel to the death with Hijikata. In real life, Ito was assassinated by members of the Shinsengumi after his plan was exposed. Now, I fully acknowledge that the differences I highlighted here sound absolutely nitpicky. But the point I'm trying to make here is that Gintama is not a history textbook. By no means is this a slight on Sorachi. In fact, I am of the opinion that him being free and not shackled by historical details greatly helped the series overall. But that's a separate debate for another time. Anyways, the next interesting arc I want to touch upon is the courtesan of a nation. At this point, most of the things I've covered in the previous video will come back into play. So to briefly summarize, the Bakufu was muddled with crisis, and Japan was full of angry people. The arc itself revolves around Gintoki and Ko's effort in exposing Tokugawa Sadasada's underhanded means of seizing power. Sadasada himself was named after Tokugawa Ieyasu, the ruling shogun at the start of the Bakumatsu period, but his character more closely resembles Lee Naosuke, the top dog of the shogunate at the time. In real life, Ieyasu was a weak and ailing young man, so the one who was effectively in charge was none other than Lee Naosuke himself. At the face of an impending national collapse, Lee's vision of how to handle the crisis was through the use of an iron fist. To his credit, he effectively revamped the indecisive facade of the government to become something that's closer to how it once was, a ruthless dictatorship. In essence, going from being viewed as simply incompetent to being viewed as purely evil. One of the first tasks Lee had to deal with was appointing the heir to the shogun. He eventually appointed Tokugawa Iemochi, an even younger man than Ieyasu with his own personal set of health concerns. Of course, there were other factions that opposed this, but with Ieyasu's untimely death, along with the lack of any apparent heir, the Bakufu was granted no time at all to carefully examine their choices. As such, Iemochi, who by the way was also the main inspiration for Shigeshige, was appointed shogun with little to no competition, and effectively became Lee's political puppet. During his relatively short tenure, Lee was able to accomplish numerous noteworthy tasks, amongst which includes forcing moderate daimyos to resign, ordering the commencement of the Ansei Purge, placing his political rivals under house arrest, telling the outer elites to bugger off and not get involved in neither internal nor external affairs, as well as imprisoning and executing 69 anti-Bakufu activists, to name a few. You can observe how these events mirror Gintama's narrative. For example, in the series, Tokugawa Sadasada was portrayed to be the one behind the Kansei Purge, which was based on the Ansei Purge of real life. Another similarity between the two is how they both had attempted to sabotage their political rivals. In real life, Lee had put Tokugawa Nariaki, along with his family, under house arrest. This was because Nariaki's son, Yoshinobu, had been groomed to be the proper heir to the shogun, which greatly threatened Lee's position. And in Gintama's world, Tokugawa Sadasada had attempted to assassinate Hitotsubashi Narinari and Hitotsubashi Nobunobu for the same reasons, as revealed in Isaburo's flashback. Additionally, Lee Naosuke and Tokugawa Sadasada were both eventually assassinated by radical shishis. Of course, the other elephant in the room for this specific arc is the subplot of the relationship between Roten Maizo and Suzuran. From my own personal research, I was unable to find a single connection to any real-life occurrences, which led me to believe that this is an original plot thread weaved by Sorachi himself. Lastly, the final pair of arcs I want to cover is Shogun Assassination and Farewell Shinsengumi. According to the wiki, Shogun Assassination is largely based on the Second Choshu expedition, as well as the preparation for the Boshin War, while Farewell Shinsengumi is mostly inspired by the Boshin War itself. With that said, honestly, I have a hard time comprehending the rationale behind these claims. Nevertheless, let's examine the historical events anyway. First, recall how the shady daimyos were not on good terms with the shogunate. The most notorious shady daimyos originate from the domains of Satsuma and especially Choshu. In 1864, amidst the national unrest, a group of Choshu elites attempted to seize control of the imperial palace. This group of shishis allegedly wanted to restore the emperor's political power by obviously taking the imperial family as hostage. I guess? Regardless of the reasoning, their attempt was swiftly foiled by forces from other domains, amongst which, oddly enough, included Satsuma. As the Choshu troops were retreating, they started setting fires, which would eventually spread uncontrollably across the location. This resulted in several casualties, as well as causing serious damages to the surroundings. The event would later be known as the Kinmon Incident. Upon hearing the news, the Bakufu seized this opportunity to launch a military expedition against the Choshu domain. This was done under the pretext of punishing Choshu for their assault on the imperial palace, while also presumably to carry out the Bakufu's personal agenda against them. Initially, Satsuma was delighted to continue licking the Bakufu's boots, while simultaneously weakening a rival domain in the process. But they soon realized that they themselves might end up being the Bakufu's next target, especially considering their own ancestral long strife. To quell this ever-escalating conflict, Satsuma brokered a compromise between the Bakufu and Choshu. This essentially allowed the shogunate to execute those personally responsible for the Kinmon Incident, without involving any innocent civilians. And thus, the first Choshu expedition ended without much of a fight.
Is this easy mode?
At first glance, this seemed like a decisive victory for the Bakufu, but trouble was brewing in the background, and the clock continued on ticking. Choshu was meant to serve as an example of what would happen if you try and cross the shogunate. But instead, shishis across the country saw this as an opportunity to further fuel their own propaganda and framed Choshu to be a role model for what they aspired to be. Therefore, the converts, as in those who just started subscribing to the Sono Joey Manifesto, started to congregate around Choshu. further increasing the domain's notoriety. This would all culminate when a conspicuous man from Tosa named Sakamoto Ryoma successfully arranged a secret alliance between the rivaling domains of Satsuma and Choshu. This coalition would commonly be referred to as the Sacho Alliance, and their goal was to overthrow the government. At the other end, still living the highs from their previous victory, while also growing wary of the Shishi's ever-expanding threat, the Bakufu were compelled to be proactive. As such, they went in for seconds and organized a small troop to carry out another military expedition. Back at the drawing boards, the Bakufu had expected Satsuma's cooperation, similar to how the Kinmon incident went. But unbeknownst to them, Satsuma were already in cahoots with Choshu. As a result, the Bakufu wasn't able to mobilize enough forces, which ultimately led to their humiliating defeat. And that's pretty much the gist of the second Choshu expedition. As to how this relates to the Shogun Assassination arc, I'm still honestly perplexed. But if I were to try and take a jab at it, both this arc and the second Choshu expedition marks the point of no return for the Bakufu. The aftermath of both of these occasions would profoundly influence the political landscape of Japan for the events that followed. In addition, Shige's inspiration, Tokugawa Iemochi, also died amidst this affair. But that's as far as I can see. In real life, Iemochi died from a reported heart failure that allegedly stemmed from thiamine deficiency, not because he was assassinated. He also didn't masquerade as an Oniwaban student during his childhood, nor did he flee to the ninja village of Iga amidst the turmoil. Now, going back to real life, the newly inaugurated shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, was placed in an unfavorable position from the get-go. The Bakufu had just been publicly humiliated by the Sacho Alliance, and foreign pressure wasn't getting any better. In the meanwhile, other actors were also starting to make their appearance. Besides Satsuma and Choshu, the Tosa domain also actively denounced the shogunate, but they were immensely more moderate compared to the radical Sacho Alliance. This is clearly apparent when the Tosa daimyo attempted to engineer a peaceful way out from this nationwide conflict. Accordingly, Tosa stumbled across the innovative idea of starting a dialogue with the shogun, and thus they arranged a summit. Unsurprisingly though, their individual objectives were so far apart that the conversation concluded with Tosa essentially giving Tokugawa Yoshinobu an ultimatum. The shogun were to relinquish his title, abolish the shogunate, and return political power to the imperial family, all of which were very onerous. But by the end of 1867, Tokugawa Yoshinobu ultimately agreed upon these demands, under the condition that the Tokugawa family would be granted an executive position within this new government. Tosa raised no objections, but the Sacho Alliance was not having any of it. In 1868, troops from Satsuma and Choshu marched towards the imperial palace and essentially declared that the Tokugawa lineage would have no place at all in this new era. The Sacho Alliance launched an attack, clearly targeting Tokugawa Yoshinobu. The shogun attempted to resist, but was inevitably overpowered and forced to retreat back to Edo. The alliance gave chase and somehow managed to lay siege upon the capital. By this stage, the shogun was cornered and was eventually forced to surrender everything in his possession. Thus, the Tokugawa regime came to meet its end. But the conflict still hasn't ended. The remaining Bakufu officials, who still had yet to accept the situation, continued on fighting. Within the span of roughly 1 year, the remnants of this Bakufu were pushed all the way up to the northern island of Ezo, formed their own state, waged a war against the imperial army, and in the end, were still eventually defeated. And that's basically the Boshin War in a nutshell. Again, I have a hard time seeing the relationship between it and Farewell Shinsengumi. If I were to guess, they both tackle the eventual downfall of the Tokugawa shogunate, but honestly, that's all I can come up with. During the actual Boshin War itself, Hijikata was killed in action, and Kondo was forced to commit seppuku. Let's just say I'm glad that Sorachi didn't end up going for that route, to say the least. So, long story short, Gintama's plot is mostly distinct from historical events, even though the narrative does indeed reference a lot from history. To end off, I would just like to acknowledge the possibility that some, if not all, of the plot threads I mentioned here may have stemmed from urban legends instead, that are not covered in any piece of written literature, or that I had simply not conducted enough research. As such, please be aware that there may be a case or two for false negatives here. And with that, folks, thank you all for watching, and see you next time.